The night air was crisp and still as Officer Mike Chen drove his patrol car down Oak Street, his headlights sweeping across the empty sidewalks. It was just another quiet night shift in the small town of River Valley, where most people were already tucked away in their warm beds. The clock on his dashboard read 11:45 p.m. as he approached Riverside Park, a familiar stop on his regular route. The park looked different at night. The cheerful playground equipment cast long shadows under the streetlights, and the usually bustling basketball courts lay silent. Officer Chen had been patrolling this route for nearly 8 years, and he knew every corner of this neighborhood like the back of his hand. But lately, something felt different. It started 3 nights ago. He had noticed a small shadow near the old blue slide, something that seemed out of place in the otherwise empty park. At first, he thought it might have been a stray cat or maybe some teenagers hanging out after hours. But there was something about the way the shadow moved, or rather, didn't move, that kept nagging at him. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247, he spoke into his radio, keeping his voice low. "Just doing another check of Riverside Park." "Copy that, Unit 247, came the dispatcher's response, slightly crackled through the static. Officer Chen pulled his car into the park's empty parking lot, turning off the engine but leaving his headlights on. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the playground equipment like silent sentinels. He sat there for a moment, watching and waiting. The digital numbers on his dashboard clicked to 11:52 p.m. Then he saw it again, that same shadow, barely visible behind the slide. It was so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, but his years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts. Something wasn't right. He grabbed his flashlight from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. The sound of his boots on the asphalt seemed unusually loud in the nighttime quiet. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the faint smell of autumn leaves and distant rain. "Hello," he called out, his voice firm but gentle. "This is the police. The park is closed after dark." No response came, but he could have sworn he saw the shadow shift slightly. Officer Chen had dealt with all sorts of situations during his night patrols: rowdy teenagers, homeless individuals seeking shelter, even the occasional raccoon causing mischief. But something about this felt different. His heart wasn't racing with the anticipation of danger. Instead, it was heavy with an unexplainable concern. He walked slowly toward the playground, his flashlight beam sweeping across the ground. The wood chips crunched softly under his feet as he approached the slide. The closer he got, the more certain he became that someone was there. "I'm not here to cause any trouble," he said, keeping his voice steady and reassuring. "I just want to make sure everything's okay." As he rounded the corner of the slide, his flashlight beam revealed something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, huddled in the small space between the slide and the support beam, was a small figure. It wasn't a stray cat or a teenager, it was a child. The little girl couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. She was curled up on a thin blanket that had seen better days, using a worn backpack as a pillow. She wore a clean school uniform, though it was slightly wrinkled. Her long dark hair was neatly braided, and despite her circumstances, there was a dignified composure about her that seemed far beyond her years. Officer Chen had seen many difficult things in his career: car accidents, domestic disputes, robberies gone wrong. But nothing had prepared him for this. His hand, still holding the flashlight, began to tremble slightly. The girl looked up at him, not with fear or defiance, but with a quiet resignation that broke his heart. She didn't try to run or hide. Instead, she sat up straight and met his gaze directly. "Good evening, officer," she said softly, her voice clear and surprisingly steady. "I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to be here." Officer Chen had to take a moment to steady himself. In all his years of service, he'd never heard a child speak with such composed politeness while being found in such circumstances. He slowly knelt down to her level, being careful to keep some distance so as not to frighten her. "Hi there," he replied, deliberately softening his voice. "You're right, the park is closed at night. But I'm more concerned about why you're out here by yourself. Aren't you okay?" The girl smoothed out her skirt, a gesture so normal and everyday that it made the situation feel even more surreal. "I'm fine, thank you," she answered. "This is just my temporary home." The word temporary hit Officer Chen like a physical blow. He noticed how organized her small space was. The blanket was laid out carefully, her backpack was zipped up neatly, and there was even a small stack of books placed carefully on a plastic bag to protect them from the ground. "How long have you been staying here?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Just a few days," she replied, then added quickly, "but I go to school every day, and I keep up with my homework. I haven't missed any classes." Officer Chen felt something in his chest tighten. The pride in her voice when she talked about not missing school, the careful way she had maintained her appearance, the almost apologetic tone when explaining her situation, it was all too much. He thought about his own daughter at home, safe in her bed, and for the first time in his 15 years of service, he felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. The girl noticed his reaction and, incredibly, seemed concerned for him. "Please don't worry, officer," she said, reaching into her backpack and pulling out a small packet of tissues. "I'm really okay. Would you like a tissue?" The simple gesture of kindness from a child who had so little to give was what finally broke him. A tear rolled down his cheek as he gently declined the offered tissue. In that moment, he made a silent promise, not just as a police officer, but as a human being, that this child's life was about to change. He cleared his throat and tried to smile reassuringly. "Thank you, but I think we need to find you somewhere safer to sleep tonight. Would you be willing to tell me a bit more about your situation? I want to help, but I need to understand what's happening." The girl looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing her options. Then she nodded slowly, beginning to share a story that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone who would come to know her. Above them, the stars continued their silent vigil, witnesses to a moment of human connection that would spark a chain of events nobody could have predicted. Officer Chen sat down on a nearby bench, making sure to keep a respectful distance from the little girl. The playground equipment cast long shadows around them, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. He needed to handle this situation delicately. This wasn't just another case to be processed and filed away. "My name is Officer Mike," he said softly, choosing to use his first name to seem less intimidating. "Would you mind telling me yours?" The girl hesitated for a moment, then straightened her school uniform skirt, a gesture that seemed both practiced and protective. "My name is Annie," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear as a bell in the quiet night. Officer Chen noticed how she kept her small hands folded neatly in her lap, how her school shoes were carefully placed next to her makeshift bed, how everything around her was arranged with precise care. This wasn't a child who had grown up on the streets. This was someone who knew what a home should be like. "Annie," he repeated gently, "how old are you?" "I'm 9.5, she answered, adding the half with the kind of importance only children attach to partial years. Then, as if wanting to prove her maturity, she continued, "I'm in 4th grade at Pine Grove Elementary. Mrs. Wilson is my teacher." The mention of school made Officer Chen's heart ache even more. He was a child sleeping in a playground, yet still concerned about her education. He noticed a math workbook peeking out of her backpack, its corners worn from frequent use. "Do you mind if I ask why you're sleeping here instead of at home?" he inquired carefully, watching her expression for any signs of distress. Annie's composure wavered slightly, but she quickly gathered herself. "Mom is sick," she explained, her voice steady but her fingers now fidgeting with the hem of her skirt. "She's in the big hospital down on Maple Street. The doctors said she needs to stay there for a while." Officer Chen felt his throat tighten. "And there's no one taking care of you at home?" Annie shook her head, then added quickly, "But I'm doing okay. I wake up early every morning and use the bathroom at the gas station to brush my teeth and wash up. Mr. Pat, who works there, is nice. He lets me use the employee bathroom because it's cleaner. I have my school clothes in my backpack, and I iron them in the library after school using the craft table." The matter-of-fact way she described her survival strategy made Officer Chen's eyes burn with unshed tears. He thought about all the little things parents do for their children every day, things this young girl had figured out how to do for herself. "How long have you been staying here, Annie?" "This is my 4th night," she replied, then added with a hint of pride, "I haven't been late to school once. And I got an A on my science test yesterday." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a slightly crumpled test paper, holding it out for him to see. Officer Chen took the paper with trembling hands. There it was, a bright red A at the top of the page with a gold star sticker next to it. The date showed it was from yesterday, and all the answers were written in neat, careful handwriting. He had to take a deep breath to steady himself. "That's really impressive, Annie," he managed to say. "But you know you can't keep sleeping here, right? It's not safe for a young girl to be out alone at night." Annie's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "I know, but I didn't know what else to do. They might take me away if they find out Mom is sick, and then who would visit her? She needs me to bring her the crossword puzzles from the newspaper. They help her stay positive while she's getting better." The simple mention of crossword puzzles nearly undid Officer Chen completely. He could picture this little girl dutifully collecting newspapers and bringing them to her sick mother, all while secretly sleeping in a playground and maintaining her grades. "Annie," he said gently, "I want to help you. There are people who can make sure you're safe and make sure you can still visit your mom. Would you trust me to help you with that?" Annie looked at him for a long moment, her young face showing wisdom far beyond her years. "Will they separate us?" she asked, her voice smaller now. "Mom said that sometimes when parents get sick, they take their kids away forever." Officer Chen shook his head firmly. "Not forever, Annie. Sometimes kids need a safe place to stay while their parents get better, but that doesn't mean forever. And I promise you this, I will personally make sure you can visit your mom as much as possible." He watched as she processed this information, her small fingers now clutching the strap of her backpack. The street lamp above them flickered briefly, casting shifting shadows across her face. "Can I take my books?" she asked finally. "And my school uniform? I have a presentation in class tomorrow about the solar system." Officer Chen felt something in his chest break and mend at the same time. "Of course you can," he assured her, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll make sure you have everything you need for school." Annie nodded slowly, then began to carefully pack her few belongings. She folded her blanket with precise corners, tucked her books away neatly, and lined up her shoes before putting them in her bag. Every movement was deliberate, organized, the actions of a child trying desperately to maintain order in a world that had turned upside down. As Officer Chen watched her gather her things, he made a series of quick calls on his radio, speaking quietly but urgently with dispatch. He knew the system, knew the procedures, but he also knew that sometimes the system needed a human touch. He thought about his wife at home, about her kind heart and the spare bedroom they had been meaning to redecorate. "Annie," he said as she zipped up her backpack, "would you like to meet my wife? She makes the best hot chocolate in town, and she would love to hear about your science presentation." For the first time that night, a genuine smile crossed Annie's face, small and hesitant, but real. "With marshmallows?" she asked hopefully. Officer Chen felt his own eyes crinkle with a smile, even as they remained damp with emotion. "Definitely with marshmallows," he promised. "And tomorrow, we'll go visit your mom together. How does that sound?" As they walked toward his patrol car, Annie's small hand found its way into his, trusting and vulnerable. The playground behind them stood silent and empty now, but somehow different, a place transformed by one child's courage and one officer's compassion. The kitchen in Officer Chen's home was warm and inviting, filled with the sweet aroma of hot chocolate. His wife, Linda, moved quietly around the space, preparing a late-night snack for their unexpected guest. Annie sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug topped with mini marshmallows, her backpack still firmly by her side. Linda had taken one look at the situation when they arrived and understood immediately. Years of social work had taught her when to ask questions and when to simply offer comfort. Right now, comfort was winning out, in the form of warm drinks and chocolate chip cookies she'd pulled from the freezer and quickly baked. "Would you like another cookie, sweetie?" Linda asked, her voice gentle. Annie nodded shyly, reaching for a second cookie with careful movements, as if afraid to make even the smallest mess. Officer Chen watched as his wife sat down at the table, noting how she positioned herself close enough to be supportive, but far enough away to give Annie space. It was time to understand the full story. "Annie," Linda began softly, "can you tell us a bit more about your mom? How long has she been in the hospital?" Annie took a small sip of her hot chocolate, leaving a tiny marshmallow mustache that she quickly wiped away with her napkin. "It's been 2 weeks now," she replied, her voice steady but quiet. "She started coughing really bad one night after work. She said it was just a cold, but then it got worse. She paused, carefully breaking her cookie in half before continuing. One morning, she couldn't get out of bed. She was breathing funny, like it hurt. I called 911 like she taught me to do in emergencies. There was a hint of pride in her voice at having remembered her emergency training. Officer Chen and Linda exchanged a quick glance. A 9-year-old girl, handling an emergency with such composure, it was both impressive and heartbreaking. "That was very brave of you," Linda said warmly. "Do you know what the doctors said was wrong?" Annie nodded, her face serious. "They said it's pneumonia," she pronounced carefully. "Mom's lungs got really sick. She has to stay in the hospital until she can breathe better. The nurses are really nice. They always save an extra Jell-O cup for me when I visit after school." "You've been visiting her every day?" Officer Chen asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir," Annie replied. "I take the bus from school to the hospital. It's the number 42 bus. Mom made sure I memorized the route before she got sick. She always thinks ahead like that." Her voice carried a note of admiration for her mother's foresight. "But, sweetie," Linda gently pressed, "who's been taking care of you while your mom is in the hospital? There must be someone." Annie's shoulders tensed slightly, but she kept her composure. "Mom and I, it's just us," she explained. "Has been since I was little. We don't have other family around. Mom works really hard at the grocery store to take care of us." She hesitated, then added, "She's the best mom in the world." Officer Chen felt his throat tighten as Annie continued her story, explaining how she'd managed on her own these past 2 weeks. She described her daily routine with the matter-of-fact tone of someone much older, waking up early in the playground, using the gas station bathroom to clean up, attending school as if everything was normal, visiting her mom at the hospital, doing her homework in the library until it closed, then returning to her hidden spot behind the slide. "I didn't want to worry Mom," Annie explained, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "She needs to focus on getting better, and I was afraid." She trailed off, staring into her now empty mug. "What were you afraid of, sweetheart?" Linda prompted gently. "I heard Mom talking to the nurses about insurance and bills," Annie said. "She was crying when she thought I was asleep. And then I heard them talking about social services." Her hands gripped her mug tighter. "At school, Tommy told me that when his cousin got sick, social services took the kids away and put them in different homes. I can't leave Mom alone. She needs me." The room fell quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Officer Chen watched as his wife discreetly wiped away a tear. Here was a child who had created an entire survival system, not out of recklessness or rebellion, but out of love and fear of being separated from her only parent. "Annie," Linda finally spoke, her voice firm but kind. "What you did shows how much you love your mom. But you know what? Part of loving someone is letting others help when things get tough. Your mom would want you to be safe." "But what if they don't let me see her?" Annie's voice cracked slightly, showing the first real sign of her young age since they'd found her. Officer Chen leaned forward, his face serious. "Annie, I make you this promise. We will figure this out together. No one is going to keep you from seeing your mom. Sometimes families need help, and that's okay. It doesn't mean anyone is being taken away forever." Annie looked at him for a long moment, her young face showing a mix of hope and uncertainty. "Really?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. "Really," Linda confirmed, reaching out slowly to pat Annie's hand. "In fact, I think I might know some people who can help make things better for both you and your mom." As they sat in the warm kitchen, the clock ticking past midnight, plans began to take shape. Linda made phone calls to colleagues in social services who she knew would handle the situation with care. Officer Chen contacted the hospital to let them know Annie was safe and to get more information about her mother's condition. And Annie, finally feeling the weight of her 2-week ordeal, began to show signs of tiredness. Her careful posture started to slouch and her eyes grew heavy. But there was something different about her now, a slight relaxation in her shoulders, as if some of the burden she'd been carrying had begun to lift. "Would you like to get some sleep?" Linda asked gently. "We have a comfortable guest room upstairs. Tomorrow, we can go see your mom first thing in the morning." Annie nodded sleepily, but then suddenly sat up straight, her eyes wide. "But what about school? I have my presentation tomorrow." "I can't miss it." Officer Chen and Linda shared a look that mixed admiration with heartache. Even now, after everything, this remarkable child was thinking about her responsibilities. "Don't worry," Linda assured her. "We'll make sure you get to school on time. Your education is important, but right now you need rest." As Linda led Annie upstairs to the guest room, Officer Chen remained at the kitchen table, looking at the empty hot chocolate mug and half-eaten cookie. Sometimes, he thought, the biggest acts of courage come in the smallest packages, and the strongest hearts are found in those who have every reason to give up but choose to keep going instead. The early morning sun was just beginning to peek through the kitchen windows as Officer Chen sat at his table, still in his uniform from the night shift. His coffee had gone cold, untouched, as his mind kept replaying the events of the night. Linda had taken Annie upstairs to get some sleep, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the kitchen, couldn't stop thinking about what he'd learned. He pulled out his phone and opened the photo gallery, finding a recent picture of his own daughter, Amy, at her 10th birthday party. She was grinning at the camera, cake frosting on her nose, surrounded by presents and love. The image blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. The sound of soft footsteps made him quickly wipe his face. Linda appeared in the doorway, looking tired but determined. "She's finally asleep," she whispered, sliding into the chair next to him. "Poor thing tried to stay awake, worried about her presentation today. I had to promise 3 times that I'd wake her up in time for school." Officer Chen nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Linda reached across the table and took his hand, understanding the storm of emotions her husband was battling. "Mike," she said softly, "talk to me. In 15 years on the force, I've never seen you like this." He took a shaky breath, trying to find the right words. "She had a schedule, Linda," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. "A 9-year-old girl had a survival schedule. Do you know what she told me while you were getting the guest room ready?" Linda squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue. "She said she picked that spot behind the slide because it was safe." His voice cracked slightly. "Safe. She said the playground lights kept the area bright enough to read by, but the slide hid her from people walking by. She'd wait until all the other kids left in the evening, then do her homework there because she didn't want to fall behind in class." He stood up abruptly, pacing the kitchen floor. She had it all figured out. The gas station bathroom to wash up. The library for homework. The bus route to the hospital. His voice broke completely. She even collected newspapers from recycling bins because her mom likes doing crossword puzzles while she's in the hospital. Linda watched as her usually composed husband struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. In all their years together, through all the tough cases he handled, she'd never seen him this affected. "You know what really gets me?" he continued, leaning against the counter. "When I found her, she apologized to me. Apologized. Like she was doing something wrong by trying to survive. She was more worried about breaking park rules than her own safety." He ran his hands over his face, remembering how Annie had offered him a tissue when she saw his eyes getting wet. "All those nights I drove past that park. 3 nights, Linda. 3 nights she was there, and I didn't know. If I hadn't decided to check tonight." "But you did check," Linda reminded him gently. "You noticed something was wrong, and you followed your instincts." "She's the same age as Amy," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "When she showed me her science test, all proud of her, all I could think about was Amy showing us her test scores, how we celebrate each one, put them on the fridge." He gestured to their own refrigerator, covered in their daughter's artwork and school papers. "And you know what the worst part is?" he continued, his voice growing hoarse. "She kept everything so neat. Her uniform was folded perfectly. Her books were protected from the ground with plastic bags. She was trying so hard to keep everything normal, to be a good student, a good daughter." He couldn't continue. Linda stood up and wrapped her arms around her husband as the tears he'd been holding back finally fell. They stood there in their kitchen, the morning light growing stronger, while upstairs, a little girl finally slept in a real bed for the first time in 2 weeks. "I lost it when she described her routine," he admitted after a while, wiping his eyes. 15 years on the force, and I've never cried in front of anyone I was helping. But when she told me how she'd wait for the other kids to leave, how she watched them go home to their families, while she set up her little spot behind the slide, I couldn't hold it together." Linda rubbed his back gently. Sometimes breaking down is the most human thing we can do, she said softly. It shows we care. Officer Chen nodded, then straightened up, his police training kicking back in. We need to help them, Linda. Not just for tonight, but really help them. Her mom's in the hospital, probably worried sick, not knowing her daughter's been sleeping in a park. They need support, resources. And they'll get it, Linda assured him, a social worker experience evident in her confident tone. I've already made some calls. We'll figure out the medical bills, find them proper support. But right now, that little girl upstairs needs to know she's not alone anymore. Officer Chen looked at the clock. It was almost time for him to end his shift. But he knew he wouldn't be going home to sleep today. I want to be there when she wakes up, he said. I promised her we'd visit her mom before school. I know you did, Linda smiled softly. That's who you are. That's why you became a police officer, not just to enforce laws, but to protect people who need protecting. As the morning light filled their kitchen, Officer Chen felt both drained and determined. Sometimes the hardest parts of his job weren't the dangerous moments or the dramatic rescues. They were the quiet revelations of human struggle, the moments when he saw just how much people could endure, especially the smallest and most vulnerable among us. He walked to their refrigerator and carefully placed Annie's science test next to Amy's artwork, secured with a magnet. It was a small gesture, but somehow it felt important. In just a few hours, that would wake Annie up, get her ready for school, and begin the process of putting her life back together. But for now, in the quiet morning hours, Officer Chen let himself feel the full weight of what it meant to be not just a police officer, but a human being confronted with both the depth of suffering and the height of resilience in a child's heart. The morning rush at Pine Valley Hospital was just beginning as Officer Chen walked through the sliding glass doors, Annie's small hand held firmly in his. Linda had helped her get ready for school, making sure her uniform was freshly pressed and her hair neatly brushed. The little girl clutched her backpack with her other hand, her science presentation safely tucked inside. Good morning, the receptionist greeted them, her eyes moving curiously between the uniformed officer and the schoolgirl. How can I help you today? Before Officer Chen could speak, Annie stepped forward. I'm here to see my mom, she said clearly. Room 412. I bring her the morning newspaper. She held up the day's paper, carefully folded under her arm. The receptionist's eyes softened with recognition. Oh, you're Mrs. Lee's daughter. We've been so worried about you, sweetheart. Your mom's been asking about you constantly. Officer Chen felt Annie's hand tighten in his. He knelt down to her level. Would you like me to come up with you? He asked gently. Or would you prefer to see your mom alone first? Annie bit her lip, thinking, Could you come with me? To explain things. Mom might be upset that I didn't tell her the truth. Of course, he nodded, standing back up. As they walked toward the elevators, he could feel Annie's tension growing. The doors opened on the 4th floor, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital filled their nostrils. Room 412 was halfway down the hall. Through the doorway, they could see a woman propped up in bed, looking pale but alert. She was working on a crossword puzzle, but her eyes kept drifting to the clock on the wall. Mom. Annie's voice was small but clear. Mrs. Lee's head snapped up, her face breaking into a relieved smile that quickly turned to concern when she saw the police officer. Annie, what's going on? Are you okay? Annie rushed forward to hug her mother, careful of the IV lines. I'm okay, Mom. This is Officer Chen. He helped me. Officer Chen stepped forward as Mrs. Lee held her daughter tight, confusion and worry evident on her face. Mrs. Lee, I'm Officer Mike Chen. I need to talk to you about Annie's living situation over the past 2 weeks. The color drained from Mrs. Lee's already pale face. Living situation? I thought she was staying with Mrs. Shan from next door. Annie, you've told me. I'm sorry, Mom. Annie whispered into her mother's hospital gown. Mrs. Shan had to go take care of her sister in Ohio. I didn't want you to worry. You needed to focus on getting better. As Officer Chen gently explained the situation, Mrs. Lee's eyes filled with tears. Her hands trembled as she stroked Annie's hair, a crossword puzzle forgotten beside her. My baby was sleeping in a park. She choked out. All alone. While I was here doing crosswords. The self-recrimination in her voice was heartbreaking. Mrs. Lee, Officer Chen said firmly, "Your daughter is an extraordinary child. She maintained her grades, kept herself clean and presentable, and visited you every day. She did all this because she loves you and didn't want you to worry. But now it's time to let others help." A nurse appeared in the doorway, holding a clipboard. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. "Oh, you're here," she exclaimed. "We've been so concerned. Every morning, this little one would appear with a newspaper, stay for an hour, then disappear again. We knew something wasn't right, but she was always so well-kept, so composed." "That's my girl," Mrs. Lee said softly, pride mixing with pain in her voice. "Always taking care of everything, just like she promised her dad before he passed away." Officer Chen hadn't known about Annie's father, but it explained the absence of other family support. He pulled up a chair beside the bed. "Mrs. Lee, my wife Linda is a social worker. She's already reached out to several organizations that can help. There are programs available for families in medical crisis, assistance with hospital bills, temporary housing support." "I can't pay for any extra help," Mrs. Lee interrupted, her voice tight with worry. "The hospital bills are already—" "Mom," Annie spoke up suddenly, her voice stronger now. "Remember what you always tell me, that sometimes being brave means asking for help." The simple wisdom from her daughter's mouth made Mrs. Lee pause. She looked down at Annie, then back at Officer Chen, who nodded encouragingly. "The programs Linda's talking about exist specifically for situations like yours," he explained. "And while things get sorted out, Annie can stay with us. We live just 10 minutes from here, and we'll make sure she gets to school and can visit you every day." With Officer Chen and Ms. Linda, Annie looked up at her mom hopefully. "They have a really nice house, Mom, and Ms. Linda makes the best hot chocolate with marshmallows." A ghost of a smile crossed Mrs. Lee's face. "Hot chocolate, huh?" The nurse stepped forward. "Mrs. Lee, your latest tests show significant improvement. The antibiotics are working well. But you need peace of mind to heal properly. Knowing Annie is safe and cared for, that's the best medicine we could prescribe right now." Officer Chen watched as Mrs. Lee's resistance slowly crumbled in the face of exhaustion, worry, and the obvious care being offered to her family. "Annie," she said softly, "can you go with the nurse to get my breakfast? I need to talk to Officer Chen for a minute." Once Annie had left the room, Mrs. Lee's composure broke. "I failed her," she whispered. "I'm her mother. I'm supposed to protect her, and instead, she was sleeping behind a playground slide." "No," Officer Chen said firmly. "You raised a daughter so resourceful, so responsible, that she managed to keep her grades up while basically homeless. So loving that her only concern was not worrying you. You haven't failed, Mrs. Lee. You've just hit a rough patch, and it's okay to accept help during rough patches." Mrs. Lee wiped her eyes with the corner of her hospital blanket. You're sure your family wouldn't mind watching her? She can be stubborn sometimes, too responsible for her own good." Officer Chen smiled. "We'd be honored to help. And between you and me, I think our daughter Annie could learn a theme or two about responsibility from Annie." As if on cue, Annie returned with the nurse, carefully carrying a breakfast tray. She set it down and immediately reached for the newspaper she brought, opening it to the crossword page. "Mom, this one looks really good today. Want to work on it together before I have to go to school? I still have time before my presentation." Officer Chen watched as mother and daughter bent their heads over the puzzle, their matching dark hair falling forward, their faces reflecting the same determined concentration. Sometimes, he thought, the most important police work happened not in dramatic chases or investigations, but in quiet hospital rooms, where broken pieces of lives could begin to be put back together. Word spread quickly through the small town of Pine Valley. It started with a quiet conversation in the police station break room, where Officer Chen shared the story with his fellow officers during shift change. By afternoon, the story had made its way to the local businesses, schools, and community centers. Not as gossip, but as a call to action. The first to step forward was Mr. Pat from the gas station. When he learned that the polite little girl who used his bathroom every morning had been homeless, he walked straight to the police station with tears in his eyes. "I knew something wasn't quite right," he told Officer Chen, his voice rough with emotion. "She was always so careful, so thankful for using the bathroom. I started leaving out fresh paper towels and keeping the soap dispenser extra full. He pulled out an envelope. "It's not much, but it's everything in our store's coffee fund. Maybe it can help with some hospital bills." At Pine Grove Elementary, Annie's teacher, Mrs. Wilson, gathered her colleagues after learning why her star student had seemed more tired lately but had never missed an assignment. She gave her science presentation today. Mrs. Wilson told the other teachers, wiping her eyes. "Did a wonderful job explaining the solar system, all while carrying such a heavy burden." The teachers immediately began planning. Within hours, they had organized a meal train for when Mrs. Lee returned home and arranged for Annie to get free lunch at school. The school principal made a quiet phone call to the district office, and by the end of the day, Annie's school fees for the entire year had been waived. The school counselor set up daily check-ins, making sure Annie had a safe space to talk about her feelings. At the hospital, the nurses who had watched Annie faithfully visit her mother each day took action in their own way. They coordinated their schedules to ensure Mrs. Lee always had friendly faces caring for her, and they started a collection of puzzle books to keep both mother and daughter entertained during visits. Linda's connections in social services proved invaluable. She worked tirelessly, navigating the system with the expertise of someone who knew exactly which doors to knock on. By the end of the week, she had secured emergency housing assistance, medical bill support, and connected Mrs. Lee with a program that would help her find a better-paying job once she recovered. Officer Chen's daughter, Emmy, gave up her Saturday morning cartoons to help clean out their guest room. "Annie needs a proper space," she declared, moving her extra books and toys to make room. "Mom, can we put up some stars on the ceiling? She really likes astronomy." The local grocery store where Mrs. Lee worked sent their human resources manager to the hospital. Instead of the termination papers Mrs. Lee had been dreading, she brought news of extended medical leave and a promise that her job would be waiting for her. "We take care of our own," the manager said firmly, patting Mrs. Lee's hand. "You just focus on getting better." Even the owners of the playground where Annie had slept were moved to action. The City Parks Department organized a safety initiative, ensuring better lighting and regular patrols. They didn't want another child to ever feel that hiding behind a slide was their only option. Back at Officer Chen's house, Annie was slowly adjusting to having a safe place to sleep. Linda noticed how she still folded her clothes with military precision and kept her backpack packed, old habits of survival hard to break. But there were changes too, small signs that she was beginning to feel secure. One evening, Officer Chen found her teaching Amy how to organize her school supplies. "If you put your homework folder on the left and your reading book on the right," she explained seriously, "you'll always know where everything is." Amy listened with rapt attention, already looking up to her temporary housemate. "Can you help me with my science homework too? Mom said you got an A on your presentation." The police department's support extended beyond Officer Chen. His colleagues took turns driving by the hospital during their patrols, waving to Annie during her visits with her mom. The dispatch office kept a calendar of Mrs. Lee's treatment schedule, making sure someone was always available to give Annie a ride if needed. Local businesses began quietly contributing what they could. The bookstore owner set aside damaged books that were still readable, creating a small library for Annie's hospital visits. The laundromat offered free services to the Chens, knowing they had an extra person's clothes to wash. The diner near the hospital started sending up free meals to Mrs. Lee's room whenever Annie visited. But perhaps the most touching response came from Annie's classmates. Once they learned about her situation, there was no teasing, no gossip. Instead, they showed their support in ways only children can. They shared their snacks at lunch, saved her a seat on the bus, and made sure she was included in playground games. "Mom," Annie said one evening, doing homework at the Chen's kitchen table, "I didn't know so many people could be so nice." Linda looked up from where she was preparing dinner. "Sometimes it takes a whole community to help a family stand up again," she replied softly. "And sometimes being brave enough to accept help inspires others to be their best selves." The response wasn't just about money or services, it was about showing a mother and daughter that they weren't alone. Each small act of kindness was a thread in a safety net, woven by a community that refused to let one of their own fall through the cracks. As Officer Chen watched all of this unfold, he realized that finding Annie that night hadn't just changed her life. It had given an entire community the chance to show its true heart. In helping one small family, they had all somehow become better versions of themselves. The playground where he had found Annie now looked different to him during his nightly patrols. What had once been a place of hidden struggle had transformed into a symbol of hope, a reminder that sometimes the darkest moments can bring out the brightest lights in humanity. 3 months had passed since that fateful night in the playground. The orphan leaves were starting to turn golden when Mrs. Lee finally walked out of Pine Valley Hospital, Annie holding tightly to her hand. Officer Chen and Linda stood nearby, watching the reunion with misty eyes. "Remember to take it easy," the discharge nurse reminded Mrs. Lee, handing her a folder of follow-up instructions. "Your body still needs time to recover completely." "Don't worry," Annie said with a proud smile. "I've already made a schedule for Mom's medications and rest times. Ms. Linda helped me write it all down." The past 3 months had transformed both mother and daughter. Mrs. Lee had regained her strength, her face now showing healthy color instead of the pale exhaustion of illness. Annie had flourished in the Chen household, though she never lost the sense of responsibility that made her so special. Their new apartment was ready for them, a bright 2-bedroom unit just a few blocks from both the school and Mrs. Lee's workplace. The community's support had made it possible, with the local housing authority expediting their application and several businesses pooling resources to cover the security deposit. "I can't believe how much has changed," Mrs. Lee said softly as they drove to their new home. 3 months ago, I thought we'd lost everything." Annie squeezed her mother's hand. "We didn't lose anything, Mom. We just found out how many people wanted to help us." The apartment building came into view, a modest but well-maintained complex with a small playground visible from their unit's windows. As they pulled into the parking lot, they saw a small crowd gathered near the entrance. Mr. Pat from the gas station was there, holding a basket of cleaning supplies. Mrs. Wilson from school stood next to a stack of books and school supplies. The hospital nurses had come during their break, bringing home-cooked meals for the freezer. Even the dispatch officers from the police station were there, carrying boxes of household items. "Welcome home," they called out as Mrs. Lee and Annie stepped out of the car. Inside, the apartment was a testament to community kindness. The furniture had been donated by various families, each piece carefully selected and cleaned. The kitchen was stocked with groceries. On the wall of Annie's new room, glow-in-the-dark stars had been arranged to match the real constellations, a weekend project Emmy had insisted on completing for her friend. Mrs. Lee tried to thank everyone, but kept getting overwhelmed with emotion. Annie, showing her usual practical nature, started organizing the help. "Mom needs to rest first," she announced to the group. "Doctor's orders. We can unpack everything else later." Officer Chen watched as the little girl who had once hidden behind a slide now confidently directed adults, making sure her mother's comfort came first. The change in her wasn't just about having a safe place to sleep, it was about knowing she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her small shoulders anymore. That evening, after everyone had left and the Lees had settled in, Officer Chen made one final stop during his patrol. Linda had packed them a home-cooked meal, and he wanted to make sure they were doing okay. He found them sitting at their small dining table, working on a crossword puzzle together. The scene was so normal, so peaceful, that it almost made the memories of finding Annie in the park feel like a distant dream. "Officer Chen," Annie called out when she saw him, "Look what Mom got me." She held up a brand new astronomy book. The grocery store gave her old job back, but with better pay and flexible hours so she can rest when she needs to. Mrs. Lee smiled, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. The store manager said they need someone to train new employees. Less physical work, more teaching, perfect while I finish recovering. They insisted he stay for a cup of tea, and as they sat together, Annie proudly showed him her latest science project, a model of the solar system that had won first place in the school fair. "You know," Mrs. Lee said quietly while Annie was getting more tea, "she's different now. Still responsible, still my brave girl, but lighter somehow. Like she knows it's okay to be a child again." Officer Chen understood exactly what she meant. He'd seen the change himself, how Annie now played with Amy after school instead of rushing to do homework, how she joined the science club without worrying about taking up extra time, how she laughed more freely. Before leaving, he walked over to the window and looked out at the playground. It was different from the one where he'd found Annie. newer, safer, filled with the sound of children playing. But more importantly, it was just a playground now, not a shelter of last resort. "I have something for you," Annie said, running to her room. She returned with a carefully folded piece of paper. It was her latest test. Another A, but this time in creative writing. The story she'd written was about a community that came together to help a family in need. "My teacher said we should write about what we know," she explained. "I wrote about how one person helping can make other people want to help too, like a chain reaction." Officer Chen felt the familiar tightness in his throat as he read her story. She had captured everything: the fear of being alone, the courage to accept help, the way kindness could spread through a community like ripples in a pond. "You know," he said, "I think you taught all of us something important. Sometimes the people who seem the strongest still need help, and sometimes help comes from places you least expect it." Mrs. Lee wrapped an arm around her daughter. "And sometimes," she added, "the bravest thing isn't facing things alone. It's letting other people be there for you." As Officer Chen drove away that evening, he thought about how a single decision to check on a shadow in a playground had created such far-reaching changes. The story had spread beyond their small town, inspiring other communities to look more closely at family homelessness and create better support systems. But more importantly, it had reminded everyone that community wasn't just a word. It was a choice people made every day to look out for each other, to be there in both big moments and small ones, to remember that every person, no matter how young or how seemingly alone, was part of something larger. The playground where he had found Annie was different now too. The city had installed better lighting, added emergency contact information, and started a neighborhood watch program. But the real change wasn't in the physical space, it was in the way people looked at it and at each other. Every child playing there was now watched over by an entire community that had learned an important lesson about responsibility and care. Annie's story hadn't ended that night in the playground, it had only begun. And in the end, it wasn't just a story about a brave little girl or a dedicated police officer. It was a story about how hope can be found in the darkest places and how the smallest acts of kindness can light the way forward for an entire community.